This is Analytics with Asa, hosted on the FF Faceoff YouTube channel. Today, I'm joined by a good friend of mine and fellow UCF student, Nathan Wright. Nathan, how you doing, my man?
Doing all right. Happy to be
Good
here.
to have you on. So, in all of the episodes so far, we've talked a lot about music and best artists, best singers, all sorts of things. But I want to get slightly more negative on the music approach. And what I want to ask you today is that if some evil fairy goes up to you and says you have to get rid of one music genre or the Jags get deleted forever, what music genre would that be?
You know, the Jags being deleted forever doesn't sound that bad, and I might be a little happier. But I would say screamo music specifically. So not metal, because, I mean, metal is just like really hard rock music. So it's like, that's fine. But if someone's just like yelling in my ear, that's not like the most appealing for me. So that's probably my choice there.
This almost feels like a call out of my music taste, because for those who aren't aware, I am
just a little bit
metal fan. Yeah, especially the very screaming metal. But let me make a very brief case in favor of that genre. And the way that I view it is I view it as just another type of instrument, but it's just the voice being the instrument instead of just singing. And so typically with like some of the more heavier stuff, it's almost like a percussive style of singing. And then for the lighter stuff, it's almost like an emotive type of scream. And so it's definitely not pleasing to the ear at first, but I think it'll kind of grow on you if you're especially into that genre of music. I think if I had to pick one,
my family is a big NASCAR family, and they're out. Dad's side's up in like the Yee area of Georgia, so I grew up playing the NASCAR and like MX versus ATV video games, and those had screamo music on it. And I did like some of that on there, so I'm not totally hating on it. Just that's definitely my least favorite.
No, I understand that. I guess if I had to get rid of one, and this may upset a few people, but I'm not really the biggest country guy. I can definitely do some folk music. Like I can do Bob Dylan and some Pete Seeger, but country to me, especially newer country, is not really my cup of tea.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think you're really just saying that to get back at me for saying metal, but you know, we'll call it there. Yeah.
To transition a bit into the most exciting division in football, we are here today to discuss the AFC South. So for those who aren't aware, that consists of the Texans, the Jags, the Colts, and then what's the last team?
The Titans.
The Titans, who are picking first overall. So before we go team by team, I wanted to ask you this first, Nathan. What would be some of your favorite moves that this division has made so far in free agency?
Favorite moves wise, I definitely think that just not doing anything dumb in free agency is definitely a step up for these GMs, from a nice stray from apart from the course. You know, I like the Colts bringing in Danny Dimes to bring competition to Anthony Richardson. I think that front office was a little misguided in expecting ready so fast when he was really a project QB the entire time. But unfortunately, that's just the reality of the NFL, where you got to prove it very quickly once you get into the league. So bringing in a veteran that at least has shown the ability to run an offense in the event that Anthony Richardson is not up to the standard in which they are looking for was definitely a good move, because as we'll get into, their offense, despite the woes at quarterback, still was not that bad last year, at least in the span of all 32 teams. Jacksonville, I do like the offloading of the Christian Kirk contract. I'm not the biggest fan of getting rid of Evan Engram, but after thinking about it a little bit, Brenton Strange did show a lot after Evan Engram was down with an injury, where they can have somebody that is producing at least 80% of what Engram was putting up for a much cheaper rate, allowing them to spend money elsewhere. And they spent that money in a little bit of a confusing manner, bringing in multiple corner safety hybrid defenders. They might be getting into more of a versatile defensive scheme, especially with the changing of the guard at defensive coordinator. So as far as the Titans, I do really like the investment that they made on the offensive line. I think that is huge for what we're going to get into, which is everybody and their brother expecting them to take Cam Ward at number 1, and setting him up for success is the most important thing that they can be doing. So signing an offensive lineman to help protect their ultimate asset that they're about to have was a good move.
Yeah, I think the one team you did not talk about is for good reason, and that's the Texans, because the Texans, they made some very interesting moves, kind of making a weakness, which was their offensive line, into an even bigger weakness. And I know there were some, I guess, character concerns about Laramie Tunsil being like the leader of the offensive line at left tackle, but he was, I think, 3rd in pass rush win rate among tackles last season. And he had some false start issues, but I just don't really understand making a tackle such a big need whenever it was a pretty solid strength for the Texans before, and just expecting to kind of eat that up in the aggregate, to me, is a very risky move to make, especially whenever CJ Stroud was not great under pressure. So yeah, they were definitely one of the more interesting teams, but I think I agree with a lot of the moves you've been saying before. The other 3 teams, I think, made some great moves, which is kind of contrary to what we're expecting from this division.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the good news for the Texans, at least their defense is very, very good. Everything can always be improved, but at least on that side of the ball, they didn't go into the red as far as making that side worse as well. I expect that the Texans will address the offensive line in the draft, given that it's the most obvious and glaring need. And they did do a little bit by putting Cam Robinson on a prove-it deal. He has shown flashes in times, both with the Jaguars and I believe he got sent to the Vikings. And he did decently. So he's shown the ability to be a starting caliber offensive lineman, and at least having some sort of what I guess you could call a stopgap there prevents the unit from being even worse than it already is. But obviously that's the most glaring need, but luckily that's one of the few needs that they have, which is a good thing that they can afford to concentrate on one position group, so to speak.
Yeah, there's a few things I have to add to that. First is more of like a macro level conversation about how the way that the best teams typically handle free agency. Typically, they're the teams that address the needs that they have early on, so that when they get into the draft, they're not forced to reach on a guy. And I think in a way, the Texans almost did the opposite, where they're adding up some strengths that they don't necessarily need that much, but they're contributing to all of these significant needs that they're going to have in the draft. And so they're almost forced to take a tackle, whether or not they like the next tackle available. Because like you mentioned, Cam Robinson is okay, but part of the reason he wasn't amazing last season is because whenever Christian Darrisaw went down, he was the backup, and Blake Brandel was the guard next to him, and Blake Brandel's play fell off, and the Texans want to be more of a run-heavy team, but they're not able to do that because Cam Robinson is an okay pass protector. He's an abysmal run blocker. And so I find the moves that they made very questionable, but we will try to address those moves, make them a better team in the future. So if you're ready to go, I'm ready to start at the Titans and then kind of do our simulation that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm ready when you are.
Right. So let's start with, let me share screen. So let's start with what the Titans did. They were a team that had a relatively active free agency, aside from the fact that they really have not addressed the quarterback position yet, which we're going to anticipate they do in the draft. So let's see. All right, so courtesy of PFF, this is what the Titans have done so far. So probably their biggest splash is getting Dan Moore Jr. For 4 years, $82 million. He's kind of historically been a backup fringe starter type of guy. So some people think that move is a little bit questionable, but I understand it. Whenever you're so bad at that position, you need to address it in some way. Kevin Zeitler, I think, was a great move by them. And then the rest of the guys are mainly depth pieces, but did you have any notable acquisitions or moves that the Titans made in free agency?
A sneaky one I do like, despite the age, the Van Jefferson deal. Every coach will tell you that every team needs a field stretcher, no matter how prolific it might translate to the box score. It's just not something that shows up statistically. Another thing, Johnny Hecker, at least when they have to punt a lot, they're going to have a pretty good guy to pin teams deep. Dan Moore Jr., like you said, that is the market of today's offensive line contracts, that unfortunately guys that you think are going to be worth being a long-term starter or giving them the shot to be one, you have to pay them that much. It's why the Jacksonville Jaguars let Jawan Taylor walk in free agency, and he got a similar contract over in Kansas City. Kevin Zeitler, like you mentioned as well, fantastic veteran presence on that offensive line, something that Cam Ward can, spoiler alert, can rely on when times get tough. And then on the defensive side, Draymond Jones, very underrated run stopper. I have the privilege of a friend of mine having watched him for a little bit on his previous team and knowing a bit about him. And those are definitely my favorite moves, as well as Joey Sly, an underrated kicker as well. There's not a lot of big-time names to really address on the signings, but I think the best thing that they did was not hand out ridiculous contracts to too many people in order to not lock themselves into the core that they give themselves off of free agency, which is something that the Urban Meyer era Jacksonville Jaguars did when they tried to fill a lot of stop gaps all at once and hand out big contracts, and they ended up being stuck with that core. So filling some holes while maintaining cap flexibility is definitely something that was a good move by them, despite the fans maybe not necessarily loving the free agency class.
Let me ask you this. How do you think they've handled this quarterback situation so far? Do you think it's a good idea for them to kind of push all their chips on the Cam Ward table? Or do you think they maybe should have signed a veteran with hopes of competing with Cam Ward in the future, if it is going to be Cam Ward that we'll end up drafting?
I think in today's NFL, I think you're not doing yourself justice if you don't do both approaches. Rookie QBs can not work out, and it just happens that way. And I think the best approach that these teams are slowly learning is that you have to put a successful environment around them, because very, very rarely are you going to get a quarterback that can transcend the situation that they're in. And by doing the best you can to set up an environment that's going to nurture a young QB, it is now unfortunately on that quarterback's shoulders, much like we discussed with Anthony Richardson over in Indianapolis, that doing this type of setup and at least making your best attempt to create a good environment for your quarterback ends up helping you make your evaluation on a guy that you're trying to stick with as your franchise signal caller a little quicker, because if you can remove the excuse of a bad environment around, then you get a more pure evaluation of your signal caller. So
no, I think you put it perfectly.
Definitely.
There's 2 points I want to touch on. No, go ahead. Oh, okay. All right. So there's 2 points I want to touch on here. The first of which is that I think you're really onto something, that teams historically really underinvest in quarterbacks. And what I say, or what I mean when I say that, is that one, you can invest draft capital and you can invest free agency capital. It's funny because the Falcons last season were like clowned on relentlessly because they signed Kirk Cousins and they drafted Michael Penix. And I think I have more issue with the signing Kirk Cousins aspect than the drafting Michael Penix aspect. But I think in a way, they're a lot more happy now that they actually have their quarterback they want than if they were to draft like a Dallas Turner or Laiatu Latu, because those guys look pretty good so far as rookies, but it doesn't really matter because a rookie quarterback is so much more important than any other position. And so I think teams that are devoting as many assets as possible to, I guess, like get that surplus value are going to be the teams that are most successful. And so as I agree with a lot of the signings that Titans have made, I think they probably would be better off if they signed some backup quarterback that we can trust to potentially start if Cam Ward doesn't look ready right away.
Yeah, and that's where your your bridge guys that bounce around a lot, like Minshew, Justin Fields. Those are going to be your guys that I think the Titans should have brought one in, but unfortunately they didn't.
Yeah, and then like you mentioned with the concept of making a team as good as possible to eliminate like the, I guess, uncertainty about a quarterback. That's what the Bears did a few seasons ago with Justin Fields, where they're trading for receivers and they're investing in assets to know for sure, is Justin Fields actually good? And they kind of realized he's okay. He's a good runner of the football. He's not great at avoiding sacks. And those are some really critical problems with his game. And they realized, hey, we just need to move on. And even if he was pretty good, you're still going to have to pay this guy $20 million a year at his current play level, which to me is not really as much surplus value as you're hoping for. So hopefully the Titans can really address that with their Cam Ward drafting. But let's move on to their depth chart briefly. So their wide receiver situation is not looking great. Van Jefferson is their big acquisition at the wide receiver spot. Treylon Burks is still, I guess we can call him developmental, but I don't know how much more developing he can do. Their offensive line looks a little bit better than it was last season. And then as of now, Will Levis is still their quarterback, but I'm expecting that to change soon. So do you have any big needs that they may have at the offensive spot we can address in this draft to make this team better?
I mean, obviously the quarterback, but, we plan to do that. The other thing that sticks out is wide receiver, but unfortunately, as we'll get into, that this receiver class at face value is not exactly the most opportune time to be filling that need. There are some guys that can at least push Treylon Burks for the number 2 spot that you can get on day 2 to kind of help with the development of Cam Ward. And then obviously filling out that offensive line a little more. It's just a very average roster across the board in terms of talent in different position groups. This is not a team that can afford to make luxury picks, such as picking up one of the elite running backs that are plentiful this year, as well as paying up for a good offensive lineman or a good receiver, since they still need to address the quarterback position. I would say at least the most pressing needs are going to be quarterback and then trying to get a receiver for them in the second round, given that they won't be picking again until the 4th afterwards.
No, I think you put it perfectly. So let's move on to the defense, and they still have some obvious strengths. T'Vondre Sweat was a huge success in the draft last season. Jeffrey Simmons is still looking pretty good despite the age. Aside from that, things aren't really great. But do you have any immediate needs we may want to address for the defensive spots?
Yes, and despite the lack of name value that I would say that this team has, this team did finish 5th in defensive yards allowed per play. This was a very stout unit that flew under the radar in terms of how much they made their opponents work for the scores against them. You mentioned T'Vondre Sweat. He did a good job of slowing the run down, and Jeffrey Simmons as well. And then out in the secondary, having L'Jarius Sneed and Hooker, as well as the supporting cast there. They did a decent job allowing net yards of pass attempts per pass attempt that finished 12th in that category. So having a pretty decent defense all around. I think this is something where depth pieces on day 3 could come into play in terms of kind of rotating guys in and trying to give them shots to break through the roster. But ultimately, at least on this side of the ball, it is not as pressing as the offensive side.
Yeah, no, I think you put it perfectly for there as well. All right, so let's switch over to a mock draft simulator. And obviously with the first overall pick being the Titans pick, how you feeling? We go in Cam Ward, we trading back, we go in Shedeur. Let me ask you this first. Do you have a significant gap in grading between Shedeur and Cam Ward?
I do and don't. I really do value Shedeur Sanders' accuracy a lot. I think that is properly being stated. I like to say it's being understated, but obviously being a part of the Sanders family does come with the media attention where you can't really call him underrated. I don't think there's that big of a gap, but I think that Cam Ward possesses the ability to push the issue and move the needle in terms of big throws that Shedeur Sanders attempts to do so, but does not have the physical tools in order to accomplish that. And as much as I would like to trade down here or pick Abdul Carter because of their 31st ranked pressure rate last year, unfortunately, as a GM, your job is on the line every year, and you can simply not justify to most owners passing up on the opportunity to have the best quarterback of a given draft class. And with that in mind, I think you just have to take Cam Ward. Whether or not the process might necessarily be completely sound in that regard, I think Cam Ward is what you have to go with.
No, I think that makes sense because, like you said, you only get a few shots, and some coaches / GMs only get one shot at their quarterback. And it just doesn't make sense to kick it down the road when you're in such an obvious spot where, one, you need one, and two, there's a pretty clear definition on who may be the best one. So Cam Ward, I think, would be a great pick here. Quarterback of the future. And then next up, before I go really fast, did you want to consider trading up? Or are you cool with going turbo and then going to our next pick?
As much as I'd like to consider trading into the first later on at all, I believe that this team just does not have enough assets and has too many holes that it's just not a possibility that they can afford to pursue. I think they just need to sit where they are. And like I said, they really should trade down given the lack of draft capital that they have. But unfortunately, there's just not much of a market to move up to where they could get a haul for moving down like other teams have in the past, such as the Bears picking up a lot of draft picks from the Panthers, that they just have to kind of sit where they are and make their picks. They can't move up, and they can't justify moving down either.
One thing I want to note real quick is that Abdul Carter somehow fell to 9. And this is just to point out that while these simulators are really fun, yeah, they are far from perfect. And so we're really doing this exercise to not try to game the simulator too much, because that's obviously a thing we can do, but to be a kind of truth tester. And so that's what we're going to do with the Titans here. All right. Now,
and another one that another one that went under the radar is my beloved Jacksonville Jaguars taking Ashton Genty at number 5, in case you missed that one as well.
Yeah, that would be quite the move for them to make. But
so
at the 35th,
that is a move.
At the 35th overall pick, Luther Burden is available. So let me ask you
this is a no-brainer.
Okay, all right. So yeah, we won't even waste the time. Luther Burden, instant wide receiver 1.
Yeah,
he's not the most crisp route runner, but I do think his upside is definitely high enough to be worth the investment for the Titans. And you have your Calvin Ridleys, who are good at getting open on the
absolutely.
All right, so at the 4th,
absolutely, and
no, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add on to what you said as well, that absolutely, while there is a tad bit of concern with Luther Burden's route running ability, this is a receiver that was either the number 1 or 2 receiver in his respective recruiting class coming into college, did nothing but produce, contend for the Biletnikoff Award, and the term Debo role is 1,000% overused. However, that is a comp that he is receiving, whether or not he necessarily should be. I think that Debo Samuel didn't really run as much in college as he did in the NFL. I think that is a usage that Kyle Shanahan found, but I believe that the head coach, whose name escapes my mind at the moment, that comes from the Bengals system, he is a great offensive mind, and I think we'll find the best use out of Luther Burden there.
Yeah, I think there's really only 2 guys in this current draft that may deservedly earn those comparisons to Debo, and it's Luther Burden's definitely number 1. He has the highest ceiling of all the guys, but also there's Savion Williams, and he has some concerns in regard to his ability to catch the ball because his drop rate was around 10%, but he's a physical freak, and he actually lined up at running back like a significant amount of snaps when he was with TCU. And so, not going to take him this draft. He could be a guy we could take a little bit later for a different team, but those 2 guys have really high upside. So at the 103 spot, there are some needs they still have. Edge rusher is definitely going to be a big one. Like their defensive interior is rock solid, so I'm comfortable there. But is there any route you really feel like going here?
Yeah, so as a GM coming into a draft, at least in my mind, if I were in that position, the first thing that I'm looking at outside of team need is where the pockets of value are going to be in the draft. Where is the consensus on where these players are being valued by the community and other GMs, and where I can necessarily afford to kick the can a little bit down the road and still address a need at a later point while still getting a good value. You mentioned defensive end being a need, and there's a lot of elite options, but unfortunately they kind of dry up after the second round. There are definitely some interesting pieces when you get down this far, but where I'm going from here is I'm probably looking at that cornerback position. It's definitely one of the deeper positions in this draft. I think that it's definitely slept on in terms of how many options you have, and I think adding some help for L'Jarius Sneed. I'm a big fan of Dorian Strong out of Virginia Tech. I think he's a great player. He'd probably pair up very well with Sneed. Evaluating other needs here, the linebacker position, there's not a lot of strong linebackers in this draft. There are certainly some depth pieces that can bring championship caliber to the table, such as Cody Simon out of Ohio State, but he's a little later in this draft, as well as one other that I'm forgetting the name of, but Jihad Campbell being up at the top is really your best starting caliber option. So where I'm looking here as well, the Titans ranked, if I'm not mistaken, 22nd in run defense in terms of yards per attempt against their run. So I wouldn't mind taking a look at the interior defensive linemen that we have available, given how many corners are left on the board.
Yeah, there's some guys still available. Aeneas Peoples is a really good pass rusher.
And Deion Walker.
Deion Walker. Yeah, he's someone who had a little bit of a fall
Walker
from grace.
being but he still has the talent that I think can plug up a gap. And given how many corners are left on the board, I think Deion Walker would be where I would go with this next pick.
Yeah, that's cool with me. Now, what I'm hoping is that Kobe Bryant would still be available. I think he actually just went.
Dorian Strong did.
Yeah. Yeah, Mello Dotson is still there. He's part of the really talented Kansas cornerback duo. He's a little bit bigger than Kobe Bryant, 6'1", 190, but he was a rock solid cornerback for Kansas. And I think that would really address the need they may have.
And you can see on the PFF grades that he grades above 74 in both man and zone coverage, which is something you like to see, versatile in his coverage scheme. And that 6'1", 190 frame that you mentioned is going to play a lot better in the NFL. You know, you think of the receivers that he's going to have to go against, him and L'Jarius Sneed in this division. They're going to have to cover Brian Thomas Jr. They're going to have to cover Nico Collins down in Houston twice a year. They're going to have to cover Michael Pittman and Josh Downs up in Indianapolis twice a year. And I think that addressing the quarterback position with Dotson here is probably the best play.
Yeah, let's do it. All right, and then next up we have 141, 167, and then 178, 188. So next up, I think you could go a lot of routes here. One that is interesting to me is going with one of these kind of tackle guard hybrids. This does seem kind of a good spot to do that. There also is some interior defensive or interior offensive line guys.
So another bit of background on me. I'm an Ohio State fan. Not sorry about it. And I've had the privilege of watching my defensive line go up against Cornelius twice. The first time they did outstanding against that pass rush. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, in that game, we did not have a single hit on Dylan Gabriel. That's not going to come up on the stat sheet in terms of Cornelius's scouting report. But the first time that we went on the road to Eugene, we did not touch Dylan Gabriel the entire game. That's something to consider. And the other option that I'm looking at here is Seth McLaughlin. Remington, if I'm not mistaken, is the award for the best center in the country. He's the award winner for that. However, he's coming off of an injury. And if I look at his rank here at 167, phenomenal blocking grades. But if you go over to what picks we have left, I believe if we were to try and test our luck here, we could push and see if McLaughlin's still on the board while taking Cornelius here at this pick.
No, I think that's a perfect plan. You get a guy who could start at guard early, and then if you need to move him to tackle, you can if you're not loving the free agency acquisitions you made. And then, with Seth McLaughlin, like you said, injury was really the only reason he's going to be available this late. And typically guys who are kind of have lower stocks due to injury are guys that I like making bets on because teams tend to overestimate the impact of an injury. And so I think that would be a perfect play for them here.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And well, it's unfortunate because I'm going to have to watch Seth McLaughlin shut down the interior of the Jags O-line twice a year in this scenario. But, now we're in the late picks here. We're talking special teamers for the most part, and you're just really looking for guys that are going to play a role in some shape or form. I think that the bottom of the barrel, so to speak, in this QB class, I think is a little underrated. That I think a 6th or 7th round pick might be worth considering for the Titans. You could draw that up akin to the Jaguars bringing in Gardner Minshew with a dart throw pick the year that they had signed Nick Foles at free agency. And there are times and such like that, as well as the Patriots last year, they just juiced a draft pick out of Joe Milton by taking a swing on him either late in the draft or undrafted. That it's not the worst idea to just take a shot on one of these guys. Tyler Shaw definitely had a little bit of hype, as well as Brady Cook. Brady Cook had a down year, as well as the just whole Missouri team did. So I'm sure his 2024 grades are not going to look fantastic. But if I had to look here, Shaw being valued at 182, I think that given what's left on the board here, the end of this draft, it might be worth taking Tyler Shaw here just to have a second shot at quarterback, especially with the lack of veteran talent that the Titans did not bring in free agency at quarterback.
Yeah, I think you adequately made the case. The one real concern with Tyler Shaw is that he is kind of older, 25.5, which not old for a person, but is old for a quarterback draft prospect. But he did throw a great deep ball. He's someone who apparently has a good head in his shoulders. And so I'm fine. Like we already talked about, teams tend to undervalue how impactful a quarterback is. And so it's really worth it in many cases to invest as early and as often as quarterbacks as possible. One guy I want to make the case for here is Dante Thornton. He's someone who very, very raw. And when I say raw, I mean, he runs like 3 routes. He runs a 9, so he's good at just running straight. And then he runs some hitches. But aside from that, very raw. But the reason
he's so raw that he doesn't have he's so raw that he doesn't have a scouting summary on PFF.
Yeah, exactly. But the reason why I think teams will be interested in him, and I'm expecting him to go earlier than where we're picking him now, is because he's 6'5" and he runs a 4.3 flat, which you just can't teach speed. And that is like upper
absolutely
speed. So,
absolutely. And I've kind of taken the reins on a lot of this draft, so I'm absolutely open up. I will say that playing in the SEC and walking out with an 80 receiving grade is very impressive. That is about that in the Big Ten is about as close as you're going to get to facing an NFL defense week in and week out. And you mentioned both the size as well as the 4.3 speed that, like I said, when you're picking this late, you need somebody that can fill a role. And at minimum, we're talking about a special teamer. 4.3 speed is phenomenal, both as a returner or a gunner. And with the lack of talent in that receiving room, that it's worth taking another shot on another one, especially given how he did against SEC competitions.
Yeah, I think you laid the case out perfectly. Dante Thornton would be perfect here. So we did not do a lot of trading down, but I think it's mainly because a lot of the value that we were after was available at the spots we were picking. And so I'm perfectly happy with how this draft graded out. So let me ask you this. PFF does do a grading system, and obviously it is not perfect, but what do you think our grade would be according to PFF?
If I had to take a guess, I'm going to go with a B plus, just because of Cam Ward being ranked so low as he is. That's going to really drag the grade down no matter how we did the rest of the draft.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, typically they're going to put their board's value above everything else. But when you're talking about premium positions, when you're talking about quarterback, where that's the most important position in all pro sports, I think it is fine to take a swing here. B plus, you nailed it.
That's nice. And let's not forget, draft grades are not everything. You look at the classic example of the 2012 Seahawks draft that was given an F, and it ended up being a phenomenal draft. So all the GMs out there, at least, and we're going to put ourselves in that shoes, we don't really care about the grade at the end of the day. We filled the needs in a great value hunting way. And I think that this is a draft class that can produce a lot of value and long-term playability for this Titans team.
Yeah, and I think you're investing in quarterback as early as you can, which I think is almost always a great move for them to make. You're getting a quarterback a really good target, which is going to be important to making them comfortable, because Cam Ward is great at making things happen, and Luther Burden has the athletic talent as a receiver to do that as well. And so, yeah, I think I really like what they've been doing so far. So next up, we have your beloved team, the Jags. And they, in many ways, had an active free agency, but there were some things they did not do. So why don't you kind of run me down the moves that they've made that you like, moves that you didn't like? What kind of summarizes the way the Jags have handled the free agency period so far?
So it was a very up and down free agency signing period. A lot of good, a lot of confusing, a lot of bad, all over the place. And that kind of sums up the AFC South. So it's par for the course, and you don't have to do a whole lot to win this division. Starting from the top of this list, Patrick McCarry getting rid of the Robinson contract past season. That helps a lot, as well as we lost something that's not going to show up on here is Mitch Morse retiring, as well as losing Scherf in free agency. So bringing in another offensive lineman that is a veteran presence with championship pedigree is an absolutely paramount thing to do for this team. I did not love the De'Ami Brown value in terms of the money that is given to him. However, like we discussed with the Van Jefferson signing, every team needs a field stretcher. And when you watch Gabe Davis, who was brought in to be that for the Jaguars, he was not filling that role very effectively. So bringing somebody else in to try to fill that role. And ultimately, one of them, this is a one-year deal at the end of the day. So Trevor Lawrence's contract has not hit the books yet. So while it is not the greatest use of their cap space, it is something to be done with it. Turning to the secondary, and a big group for this team as a fan was watching them have just an absolutely putrid third down defense this year. They finished 30th in third down percentage converted against them. And you can directly attribute that to the net yards allowed per pass attempt, 32nd in the league. Pressure rate, 30th in the league. And QB rating, 31st in the league, as well as allowing 30th in yards per play on defense. So very obviously an absolute dire need. Something that will go overlooked in the QB department is the steep drop that the passing game had, going from Trevor Lawrence down to Mac Jones. We dropped from roughly 14th in the league down to either dead last or close to it with Mac Jones, which shows the impact that he has with the limited tools. So they definitely made the attempt to address that with Jordan Lewis and Eric Murray, two good players. However, they kind of seem to fill the same sort of role where they can both play that hybrid corner safety role, something that we already have with Darnell Savage as well, that can drop down to nickel and play back in safety. So maybe they're going for versatility here, or trying to rotate them around at the different positions to kind of see where they settle in the best in the scheme. Having multiple players of the same skill set was interesting, but at least making the attempt to address it. Looping back through to the offensive line as well with Hainsey was definitely good to see. Things that were confusing was losing Evan Engram released. I know it was a cap casualty. However, in the grand scheme of things, it's a pretty affordable deal, especially when you look at what Trey McBride just got over in Arizona, that having a veteran presence that is a core of your offensive scheme go is tough to see. I think Brenton Strange can fill that gap pretty effectively, at least 80% of the way, if you want to replace him in the aggregate in Moneyball terms. Bringing in Munt and Long to be blocking presences to help with that run game is nice to see. Overall, all of the moves make sense. There's none that stand out as something that is a waste of money or a bad move. And sometimes you cannot win the NFL. You cannot win the Super Bowl in free agency in the draft, but you could certainly lose it. And they did a better job of pulling in stopgaps and usable players than they did a couple years ago when trying to refresh to the roster. So overall, it's a very B- B kind of free agency class that it gets the job done while not being overly expensive, but not flashy either.
Yeah, I think you summarized it really well. And the fundamental philosophy is build around Trevor Lawrence. You've clearly invested a lot of money in him. You've clearly invested the number one overall pick in him. And he's proven to be a pretty solid thrower of the football. And really the problem has just been the tangential problems with receivers not being great. I mean, they've really solved that now with Brian Thomas being so good, but their offensive line not being great. And so you're getting a guy like Patrick McCarry, who's really versatile. He's played tackle, he's played guard, he's played center. That's always helpful when it comes to injury problems. You're getting Diami Brown, like you mentioned, it is a little bit of an overpay, but I do think it's more so let's capture some of that magic that existed with that Commanders team. So maybe that's why they made that move. But like you mentioned, I think they're really just plugging up some gaps so that they don't have to really reach on a player once it gets to their spot at the 5th overall and then as we get moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And
all right, so go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely like what you had to add there with the capturing Commanders magic. I think it's the same thing bringing in Ricari as well, that they're trying to establish a championship culture in that locker room, as well as bringing in Liam Cohen out of Tampa Bay. A lot of playoff experience coming in the building.
Yeah, and that's one thing we didn't talk about. And you could argue that was their biggest acquisition in this entire offseason period, that Liam Cohen was the architect of a phenomenal offense last season, utilizing Chris Godwin, who is very good, but I don't think he really compares to the talent of Brian Thomas Jr. And I'm really excited to see what they do with him because he was special despite having not perfect play calls last season. And so I think they're going to really utilize their offense around him. They could invest in another wide receiver to make that team even better. But moving on to their offense really quick, are there any immediate needs that you've noticed that we should maybe address in the draft, whether that be first round, second round, whatever you have it?
So when scouting through this offense, there is not a glaring need nor a position group that is necessarily secure and not needing to be touched at all. They've done a good job of just building out a quality unit that a lot of people won't realize was in fact a team that lost 8 to 10 one-possession games last year, as well as 3 of those one-possession games being in division where they went 3-3. And you talk about a few plays going their way. Just the first game of the season, summing it up, playing against the Miami Dolphins and Travis Etienne fumbling on the 1-yard line when they're about to go up 3 touchdowns down in Miami, turning around and losing that game. That kind of sums up the season for Jacksonville as is a team that was a lot closer than people realize, going either 0-10 or 1-10 in one possession games, something to that effect, to where just capturing a bit of spark in this draft is something that could help them flip to the other side of that in a division that is very much so up for the grabs for everybody in this division. Maybe not the Titans, but the Jaguars, Texans, and Colts certainly.
Yeah. You touched a little bit on Travis Etienne being, I guess, part of the reason they had so many struggles last season. Do you expect them to maybe move on from him this season by drafting a player? What route do you kind of want to go whenever we get into this draft simulation when it comes to addressing the running back situation?
So I think when you look at the running back class, the Jags are blessed with one of the best running back classes we have ever seen. I don't want to get hyperbolic and start saying it is as good or better than 2017, because we know how those guys' careers played out. They played out multiple all-pros out of that draft, top to bottom. Aaron Jones out of the 5th round being a multi-time Pro Bowl all-pro player. So you don't want to go that far, but you look, I mean, just at the top of the draft, there's 6, 7, maybe even 8 guys that will go by the end of day 2, just preaching how deep this class is. So the Jags are blessed in that sense. When you look at the draft capital that they have, multiple 3rd-round picks, multiple 4th-round picks, that they're right in that sweet spot where they can afford to get one of those elite talented running backs that could potentially be the best running back in the class last year, while not even having to pick them until the 3rd round or 4th round. That's certainly something I expect the Jaguars to do. And in the modern NFL, you're not doing yourself justice if you aren't constantly churning running backs to find a good one, with how many good ones there are now. And that just about every team takes a committee approach. This team already does. They took Keelan Robinson last year in the draft in the 5th or 6th round, didn't do anything. Already taking Bigsby to try to help out Etienne and him not being super effective. I 1,000% expect this team to be one that's going after a running back in either the 3rd or 4th round.
Yeah, I think you laid it out really well, that if there ever is a time to need a running back, now is the time, because you can find guys who are starting caliber all the way from the early 1st round with Genty to later 1st round with maybe Travion or Scatabo or guys like that. And then even into the 4th to 5th round, you have guys like Bashaw Tootin, who obviously have their issues, but are so talented that they could end up being starting running backs right whenever they hit that rookie camp. And so it is really a great time to need a running back. And so if there is an issue to have, I think it really could be solved in the draft, especially at the running back position. So let's move on to the defense. And they have a really interesting situation at edge rusher. So why don't you talk about that briefly, with Trayvon Walker being someone who hasn't quite lived up to the 1st overall pick expectations, but still has displayed some talent on the field.
Yeah. So, when you first watch a box score, you see the 10 sacks that he put up, and that looks impressive at first. But, we're on analytics with Asa. I'm an analyst. You dig a little deeper, and even just not even including him, looking at the team itself, 30th in pressure rate. And I'm not one to get into discussions on the internet. However, I did see a Jags fan page talking about upcoming contract extensions, and Trayvon Walker entering his 4th year. The 5th-year option is due to be picked up in May. And I think you do need to push the issue a little bit in that regard, because despite the 10 sacks, he has not been, in both the last 2 seasons, he has not been top 20 in pass rush win rate, ultimately showing that he's not necessarily winning a lot. He just so happens to be getting home when he gets to the backfield, but that is not a testament to necessarily the volume at which he is beating offensive linemen that he's going up against. And he's blessed, at least in the sense of having Josh, now Hines Allen, on the other side of the ball, as well as having brought in Eric Armstead as a veteran presence that was injured last year. I think that having him there to rotate in, a former staple of that 49ers defensive line that went to multiple NFC championships, that this is a unit that has a lot of potential, but I think in just injecting just a little bit of juice out of this draft class is something worth considering, especially given the depth of the defensive end edge rusher category, as you can get one as late as the early third round that's worth starting.
Yeah, I think you're really onto something here with Trayvon Walker, because there's no doubt value to the type of cleanup guys that exist in the NFL. It's guys who don't have the highest pressure numbers, but are able to get home with sacks. And those guys are not bad football players. But like you mentioned, you definitely want a guy who can consistently win. And you get that with Josh Hines Allen. You get that with your premier pass rushers. But Trayvon Walker, at least so far, has not really had that ability to consistently win against his man. He has the athleticism to pull off sacks, the 10 sacks he got last season, but it's not something you can really bank on whenever most of that is reliant on a quarterback scrambling out and a play is broken down and he chases a guy behind him. And so I would not be surprised to go edge rusher, especially if Abdul Carter falls. I don't know if he will. But let me ask you this. If your choice is between Mason Graham and Abdul Carter, and maybe we'll be able to make this choice, are you picking Abdul Carter, or maybe do you think we can give Walker an chance?
So I look at the defensive numbers, and I think that something that stands out to me is the team being ranked 12th in defensive rush yards allowed per attempt. Mm-hmm. That this is a team that is making teams, both if you watch on film in games as well as just looking at statistics, they force teams into these third downs and just don't have the pass rush and secondary to get off of the field. So while a interior defensive presence is something that's necessary, when you look at what Trayvon Walker was drafted as well as Josh Allen way back in the day, what Eric Armstead can do, and now possibly bringing Abdul Carter into the mix. These are all guys that can win on the inside and outside and from the off-ball linebacker position. That although Mason Graham might be one of the better game-wrecking defensive tackles we've seen in a while, and you witness on Super Bowl Sunday almost every year how important that presence is with Chris Jones over in Kansas City, that ultimately having that versatile defensive line that can move around and stunt and win from every position against these teams, I think is going to help that pressure rate a lot, and not necessarily directly addressing the interior, especially given how they did against the run and the underrated presence of Devon Hamilton on the inside.
Do you have any more takes on their defense that we may need to address, or are you ready to get going with the draft?
So this is another unit, just like the offense, that is solid. It will get the job done, but it needs a push. It needs a spark. And I expect the Jaguars, both in our mock draft today and in real life, to probably strike a balance between the offensive and defensive sides of the ball in terms of trying to bring in playmakers on both sides.
All right, then I am ready to get things going with the mock draft. And so let me ask you this. I know the speed's on turbo now. We can slow that down. If Abdul Carter is maybe there at 4, would you look into trading up, or are you okay with him potentially going to the Patriots and then we go the Mason Graham route? How much more do you value a guy like Abdul Carter over Mason Graham?
So at first glance, you look at this draft and the position that this team is in and the needs that they have. They don't need quarterbacks. So the Titans are going to take a player that the Jags are not interested in. And you could potentially see that out of Cleveland too, if they decide to go Shedeur Sanders at number 2 and shock everybody. The Jags are in a position here where you have 3 outstanding offensive tackles: Mason Graham at defensive tackle, Abdul Carter at edge rusher, and Will Johnson at corner, all of which could address needs that the Jaguars have, or at least maybe not necessarily in terms of needs, but things that would absolutely help the Jags get over to the other side of those one possession games, that I don't think this is a team that needs to trade up. And in fact, if they could create a market in which they could trade back, there are so many players that would fit what this team needs that they could move back a few spots and still get something that would be just as impactful.
Yeah. All right. So let's see if we can kind of accomplish that strategy. We'll start on turbo, but once we get things going, we can slow down a little bit. So Abdul Carter goes second, Shadur goes 3, and then Travis Hunter goes 4. So let's first check our trade offers. The nearest available is Miami at 13. My guess is they'd be willing to give us, obviously, 13, 48, and maybe 98 would be relatively realistic. Are you comfortable with going that route, or would you want to draft a player like Mason Graham, like Will Campbell? What's kind of calling your name now?
So I'm looking at that trade screen is what's calling me. And I think the first thing that pops in mind is how close to the current pick we're at that we can get. I think an artificial bidding war could possibly be created between two franchises in the Las Vegas Raiders and the Chicago Bears for the rights to Ashton Genty. Both of these teams are screaming as landing spots everybody expects for the running back. In this scenario, it does not seem in which that they are interested in moving up. I think that's something that could be monitored in real life, possibly calling up Chicago to have them move up to 5 and jump the Raiders for the right to Genty, especially with what they did along that offensive line, that it just screams that they're going after a running back. In this scenario, I think absolutely. Looking at where the Dolphins are, if that's the closest to this pick that we can move to, I think that there's a lot available on the board, as well as Malachi Starks, one that I did not mention, that could also help fill out that secondary. He's very versatile as well. So I'd be fine with moving back to the Dolphins here.
Yeah, let's do it. I'm also going to kick in 221 just to keep things a little bit more realistic, because just to show you guys, we can take pretty much their entire draft. And so we're not going to do that because that is one of the downsides of utilizing a simulator, is that there is kind of an easy way to game it, but we'll keep things realistic for now. All right, so we are dropping back 8 spots in order to pick up a 2nd-round pick and another 3rd-round pick. We're giving them a 7th-round pick. My guess is they're going to take a guy like Armand Nimbu or Will Campbell. We will see. They do take Nimbu. And then next up, we are picking at 13. Starks is still available. Will Johnson's still available. Luther Burden. There's a lot of guys available. So I like this concept of trading back. Which one are you feeling the most? Do you think Starks should be the best need to fill?
If you could scroll through the players that were picked, I'd like to see if the tackle out of Texas went. It looks like he might have. He has not. And that would be kind of one of my first choices in this scenario. If you look at what's available at offensive tackle momentarily, though, however, there are some options here between Zabel, Connerly, Simmons, Banks. I believe there's a couple more. No. Okay. So they kind of dry up there at that 1-2 turn area. But if you, as much as I'd like to address the secondary, I think what I'd like to go here is either Josh Simmons or Kelvin Banks. Both of them, Kelvin Banks holding up for Quinn Ewers for multiple years over there at Texas. I hope he was not the one that gave up the sack to Jack Sawyer when the game mattered the most in the semifinals. Josh Simmons as well, somebody that fought admirably along the offensive line. We lost 3 of the 5 starters along the offensive line over the course of the season at Ohio State. So having somebody that can move around along that line, I think would help a lot. I just want to compare them side by side momentarily.
Yeah, we can do that. So
see the two.
It looks like Simmons is a bit better of a pass blocker than a run blocker. He's built 6'5", 310, so not necessarily giant for a tackle. Comparing that to Banks, who seems to be much a little bit more balanced between the two. He is a tiny bit smaller, but he does have elite athleticism. And so I really throw it to you
Yeah.
between Simmons or Banks if you have a preference between the two, if you want to go the offensive line route.
So bias calls Josh Simmons to me. However, I think Kelvin Banks is the correct decision here.
Okay.
I just feel that he's a guy that has the pedigree as a recruit, held up for Quinn Ewers for multiple seasons, and ultimately I think is just a victim of the draft process and the combine, having Membu jump him. This is a guy that we talked about just a couple months ago being one of the top picks in the draft, and getting him at 13 is something that's certainly worth snagging up while you can.
All right, perfect. So I did set the speed to lower just in case we do want to trade up. So we can get things going there. And then what's the spot where you feel most comfortable potentially trading up? You can let me know when to pause. But is there kind of a ideal destination we should trade up to?
So there's an absolute sweet spot coming up soon that you notice that the film guys have really propped up Matthew Golden a lot. He just went, I believe, at 14, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
That there are two guys that are also victims of the draft process, in Emeka Egbuka and Luther Burden, that are both top prospects that have been revered for a long time, that the Jaguars can replace Christian Kirk in an emphatic way and honestly improve in that regard. That the spot in which the Jags should really trade up is just watching the board, keeping in touch with the GMs in this section of the draft, and watching for one of the two receivers to go and immediately hitting that speed dial to call the next team on the board to try and pick one of the other ones. And the reason trading down works so well is now there's extra ammo in that second and third round to move back into the late first to try and snag up one of these receivers for Trevor Lawrence.
Yeah, no, I like that plan a lot. Makes Lawrence's life a lot easier. So Will Johnson goes, Izaraku.
Wow, Will Johnson at 20.
All right, Egbuka just went 26.
Yeah,
so let's try to trade up with
the
Ravens. So obviously we give up 36. I think 48.
Yeah, and I would even try to see if we could do this with 48 instead of 36. I know that's not as realistic, but it's worth trying at least in this exercise.
So we would be giving up 48.70. Let's see if they want to kick us back to 183.
Yeah, and this is a Ravens team that does not have a lot of dire needs. Very talented team that unfortunately just came short in the playoffs, but they've got that MVP caliber player in Lamar Jackson, excellent run after the catch player with Zay Flowers, and just pieces all over the field. That this is a team that can move back for extra assets and fill in everywhere with this kind of move.
Yep. All right, so Luther Burden is available. Let's draft him. And then next up, we have 36.
Yeah, and that's an absolute just steal, getting one of them in the late first like that. And just filling in the need in an emphatic way is something that I would love to watch the Jaguars do as a fan. And congratulations to the New York Giants getting Colston Loveland in the second round. Just awesome value there.
Agreed. So they still have some need at the defensive interior spot. So there are some guys that are available. If you like more of the penetrating pass rushers, there's Darius Alexander. If you want like the traditional run stuff, or there's Tyleik Williams. Are there any of these guys you would want to go, or is there a different route we should maybe take?
So looking at what's on the board here, and again, going back to what we talked about on day 3 with the Titans, ultimately, this draft, I think, is very, very strong at the defensive line position, that interior D-line. There is pieces everywhere. And honestly, this is one of the better positions in this draft. One that when you scroll through the names on here, I mean, you get all the way down to Norman Lott and such in the late second here, that's kind of where it dries up. moving over to the edge rushers, I believe that there should be a couple pieces out of my Ohio State Buckeyes still on the board here with JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer, as well as other pieces that I believe when we go back to how bad that team was in the pass rush department, right here, this pick, I feel like you're doing yourself an injustice if you don't address the pass rush or the secondary. And given the benefit of the doubt of what they did in free agency, as much as I'd like to go overkill and pick another corner, I think you have to respect the money that was put out between the guys that they brought in free agency. And I think going edge rusher here might be the move, as well as I don't know, actually, this defensive interior.
There's a lot of guys still available.
Yeah, this is another nice spot to be in for Jacksonville. I really am eyeing TJ Sanders. He did very well at South Carolina over there in the SEC. They had a pretty decent season as well. Just pulling up his profile real quick.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of guys available at this spot, and this is where, in my opinion, the draft curve gets really flat, because there's guys who could go anywhere from the late first to the early third round, just given the fact that the talent is so even throughout this time. And so you have athletic freaks like Landon Jackson. You have guys who are great in the Senior Bowl like Darius Alexander. You have a lot of guys that could be going at this kind of earlier spot. One guy I do want to mention, who I don't think will take this early, but one person who's very productive is Josiah Stewart. He's not built like your traditional edge rusher. He's about 6'1". I think he's 240, 245. So he's kind of smaller for an edge rusher, but his pass rush win rate is highest among all edge rushers at 28%. And so he's someone I think could be in that kind of Nick Bonito role, where he's playing off-ball linebacker on first and second down, and then can kind of pin his ears back on the third down. But yeah, we're really able to play any route here.
Yeah, I think the next two picks for the Jaguars should really be addressing the defensive line a little bit more, or at least one of them. If you wouldn't mind scrolling down to the high 80s area just to see what's going to be there in the third round, because this is another thing that the Jags will be doing. They will have done more homework, and I think that falling back on Deion Walker, like we talked about with the Titans, he's definitely one of my favorite fallers in this draft. That's right in that sweet spot area for the Jags. So I think paying up here for one of the defensive ends that we have available is probably the best way to go, especially with how bad the pass rush was. I think Landon Jackson, or I don't want to be a homer and pick JT Tuimoloau, but him being versatile along the defensive line is something that I value a lot.
That's fine with me. We can go that route.
Yeah.
So up next at 88,
that's not going to like it.
See, this is the only issue with the simulator, is that once you set it to slower, it doesn't really speed up too much. Let me see.
Yeah.
Give me one sec. Let's see if we can figure this out.
Oh, no worries.
Okay, there we go. Let's speed it up.
There it is.
All right.
There's a lot of PFF's most likely not going to like that pick of Tuimoloau in terms of value, but I think that bringing that championship pedigree to the Jags, something that they emphasized in free agency, as well as versatility along the defensive line.
Agreed.
So as we alluded to, this is a team that will absolutely be in the market for a running back. This might not be the spot to do so, but seeing Devin Neal, Damian Martinez, Byshel Tootin all on the board, as well as that's about where the options dry up. I thought I might see DJ Giddens down this low. I think Jarquez Hunter is a very good sleeper as well in this draft. I think Giddens just went 85 to the Broncos. Yeah. Another team that's going to be in the market for a running back. It's a good year to need a running back. But, you see that you're still picking at 98. You've got multiple running back options still available, other needs needing to be filled still. I'm looking at that defensive interior now potentially, or the tight end position. Now that we have filled someone to move along the defensive line, as well as offensive line, as well as wide receiver, we've kind of addressed the trenches there. So I think the next spot that I'm probably taking a look at here is either the defensive interior or the secondary with another safety potentially.
Yeah, let's see who's available. So you said defensive interior.
Especially with having Cisco leaving free agency, is something
I think
that
we can get
went under the radar.
I think we can get one of these guys a little bit later on with Lathan Ransom or Andrew Makuba. In my opinion, Josh Farmer or Dean Walker is going to be my pick here, but it's the Jags. It's your team, so it's really up to you on what position you think would be better to address now.
No, I absolutely agree between Josh Farmer and Deon Walker being the pick here. I think I have to lean Farmer, just trusting the grades, although that run defensive grade is very atrocious.
I think he's probably better value just given his like physical ceiling. I know Dean Walker is someone who people are very scared of because of the athletic testing not looking so great, but in my opinion, Farmer would be the good move here.
Yeah, absolutely. That and just differentiating a little bit from the Titans draft, given that we just took them in another draft. And I think circling back here, I mean, we've got Makuba still on the board, and then just curious at looking at the running back position real quick, making sure those don't dry up. Yeah, Damian Martinez is still there.
Probably 126.
Yeah, and it seems like the running backs are going a little higher than where they're being ranked. But I think given that we're picking again pretty soon, I think going Makuba here and just trusting the process on one of those, as well as Jaden Blue, very slept on running back as well. It's just a super deep running back class that him being available is something that's going under the radar. But it looks like we're going to have our choice here. And I think there's still corners available as well. It's the move here, just given that he can fill that all-around role. He has the frame to do so. Trevor, while he does take his downs, I think having Burton Strange as a pre-existing check down option, as well as now acquiring Luther Burden in this draft, that you don't necessarily need to value a receiving running back as heavily at this point. I'm not sure about his pass blocking grades. I know I'm a big fan of Travion Henderson's pass blocking grade, but it looks like, Damian Martinez is phenomenal, graded all around.
Yeah, I think he'd be a perfect acquisition here. And then next up, I think because we've addressed the running back need, I hope it's okay. Good. I was scared it's going to be glitched. Because we've addressed the running back need, I think we could go cornerback if you feel inclined to do that, because there are still quite a few available.
Absolutely.
You want to go your guy Will Howard?
No, but I do believe that the Jaguars should explore bringing in more than just the backup who escapes my mind at the moment that they brought in as a veteran backup. I think
it was Nick Mullins.
The same thing.
Nick Mullins from Minnesota.
Yeah, the same thing that we talked about with bringing in a rookie QB never hurts, just to see what they have. Even though they paid Trevor Lawrence, he's not on the books for another year, and the ability to possibly see what you have long term, maybe with a not quite the same as a Jordan Love situation, but I think going over to the corners is probably the best idea here, especially given that they have a lot of draft capital and they've really addressed a lot of positions, which is very nice to see. We won't do this in real life.
Probably the best available will be Zy Alexander. There's quite a bit of a drop off between Zy and then the next person that's available. So I would probably feel most comfortable going that route.
Probably Zy.
Okay.
It would have been nice to see one of the other guys falling here, but just not the case.
Yeah, it doesn't always happen. But we've addressed most of the needs that we really have for now. And so I think that things have been good for the Jags so far. All right, next up, we are at 142. Yeah. And is there any guy really calling your name at this spot?
So one that is calling my name that we scrolled past already, still sticking with value as well as sticking pretty high. Although I don't really agree necessarily that it's a pressing need, Mitchell Evans out of Notre Dame, tight end factory, phenomenal tight end. The PFF grades do not do him justice. He had a lot better of a 2023 season before getting injured. And this is a tight end that I think can be the Brenton Strange to Brenton Strange, much like Brenton Strange was to Evan Engram.
Yeah, let's do it. All right, and then we have 3 more picks left in this draft. I think at this spot, it's good to go one of those higher ceiling wide receivers. So I don't think he'll be here. But if a guy like Kyle Williams is still available, I don't know if I've seen his name yet. But he's – no, someone took him. There's also Ricky White. There's Dante Thornton, who we've already talked about. Jalen Lane is also pretty good. It's really up to you. We don't necessarily have to go receiver, but I think that's probably going to be the most value. Aside from Caleb Bransaw, who's like a safety cornerback hybrid, really high forced incompletion rate, and he's not tiny, 6 foot 196. I think any of these guys would be good. So it's really up to you between any of those guys if you have a preference.
Yeah, I think you have to go with Jalen Lane here. I think that just continuing to provide weapons for Trevor Lawrence, as well as just addressing each and every spot on the field. This is a draft that has been very balanced at every position, and we're kind of in a spot here where now we're kind of looking at those guys that have special team roles and stuff like that, and Lane can at least start out in that department, especially given expected cap casualties of Gabe Davis after this year, as well as the gentleman we just brought in from Washington being on a 1-year deal. So
we have 1 more pick left in the 6th round. Sorry, 2 more picks left in the 6th round, but we are picking back-to-back here. So we already addressed the receiver position. At this point, if you want to go backup quarterback, we already kind of have that with Nick Mullins, but I'm cool with Ransaw, someone we already talked about with that versatility. At this point, it's really just take flyers and guys you like. He's someone I personally like a lot. But if you want to go that route, that's cool with me. If you want to go someone else, that's also cool.
Yeah, we can go with Ransaw, especially given that we did not go with Starks earlier in the draft, having another one of those hybrids that can move around, even though that's something that they did in free agency quite a bit. Just having one of those guys. And then just to be different here, I am a fan of Curtis Rourke as well. Very accurate quarterback. He did a fantastic job at Indiana this year. They really bounced back heavily. His PFF grade against Ohio State is not going to look good, but not a lot of people's does against us. And yeah, I'm a big fan of Curtis Rourke here. Just to close out, give a accurate quarterback that can provide competition to Trevor Lawrence, as well as a competent person to work against Nick Mullins in the event of an injury.
Yeah, 100%. So while the picks are kind of rattling off at the end, is there a grade that you think we got?
I think the JT Tuimoloau pick is going to hold back the grade just in terms of value. I think we're looking at another B+ range kind of grade here. But moving back,
you were right. I'm going to be slightly more optimistic. I'm going to think an A- just because we got so much value in other spots. I guess they didn't. Oh, maybe we're wrong.
I'm not a fan of Kelvin Banks apparently either,
but the rest are A's. So B+. There you go.
Another B+. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, as a fan, I would be elated with this draft. Absolutely.
Yeah, you're addressing major needs. You're just getting overall significantly better, and you're making Trevor Lawrence's job a lot easier, which is the most important thing to do as an NFL team. All right, so let's move on to the Colts. And the Colts really prioritized, I think, quality over quantity here. They got the superstar safety from Minnesota, Cam Bynum, the guy who's notorious for all the TikTok dances. Charvarius Ward, one of the best cornerbacks out of free agency. You're getting a backup / potential starter to compete with Anthony Richardson with Daniel Jones. Are there any notable moves that the Colts have made that you maybe love, maybe don't love? Let's kind of break that down a bit.
Yeah, so they took the opposite approach of everybody else in the division. They went with quality over quantity, like you said. The Jags kind of struck an in-between there. The Texans, that we'll get to in a little bit, were just rapid-firing signings everywhere. With this, I do like the Bynum signing. I like the Ward signing. This is a team that ranked 29th in yards per pass attempt allowed last year. So bringing in two guys in that secondary to help out, as well as, like I mentioned earlier, they did not have that bad of an offense, but the weakness did come from the quarterback position. They were a top 10 rushing unit, but a fairly middle-of-the-road passing unit. And bringing in Daniel Jones just to provide competition to Anthony Richardson, who has shown previous ability to lead an offense when put in a successful situation. It helps to have Saquon, but he would have Jonathan Taylor in this instance. And then just looking at the rest of this, bringing back Ashton Doolin, I think is a very underrated signing. Fantastic special teamer and very just invaluable. It does not show up on the stat sheet.
Yeah. And then I think an important thing as well is improving your team's culture. And I do think, as someone who does follow the Vikings really closely, Cam Bynum is someone that everyone in the locker room absolutely loved. And I know we laugh a little bit about like the dances and the celebrations and all that, but I do think it brings a team together to be able to do something like that. And if Cam Bynum is bringing that sort of positive culture to a team, I think that would be great for the Colts specifically, just given the fact that they have this kind of quarterback battle going on. I know there's like a little bit of controversy around their owner. And so I think that would be a great move for them. I'm really glad that they made it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, he seems like a great guy.
He does. So let's talk a little bit about their depth chart. So they're mostly solid at the receiver spot. Alec Pierce is one of those deep threat guys, contrary to what I think it was Kurt Benkirk who described Xavier Restrepo as Alec Pierce. It was someone like that, I think, just because of slot reasons. But Josh Downs is mainly their slot. Michael Pittman, their wide receiver 1. Offensive line is still pretty good despite losing a lot of their guys to Minnesota. Are there any main things that we should address if we're the Colts for their offense?
I think the glaring one is absolutely the tight end position. You look here, like Jelani Woods was a nice project case. He came in very athletic. I was looking forward to him, but unfortunately just injuries have gotten to him to where he has not been able to contribute to this offense. And that would provide both a blocking and receiving threat, both for Anthony Richardson and Daniel Jones to rely on, something that having that safety valve outside of just Jonathan Taylor is good. When you look at Alec Pierce, Adonai Mitchell, they operate pretty far downfield. Josh Downs is a good check down guy, but as well as Michael Pittman, having a bit of a setback year last year, but still a phenomenal player in his own right, underrated. Unfortunately, this is not a great receiver class in which they can really address the receiver position outside of the first round. So striking a hybrid between helping the blocking as well as the receiving, that would be the tight end position.
Yeah, no, I think that would be a perfect move. It's part of the reason why almost everyone and their mom is mocking a tight end, whether that be Colston Loveland or someone else to the Colts as early as possible. So would not be surprised to see us go that route. But yeah, I think that's going to be their most glaring need. Aside from that, they're a pretty solid offense aside from the Cole quarterback battle that's going on right now. So let's talk about their defense. It has some needs for sure. I think they did a good job of addressing most of that with their secondary getting significantly better. Their defensive line still has DeForest Buckner, who has been good for a while. Kwity Paye was someone they invested in early a few seasons ago, and then Laiatu was really productive but injured pass rusher from UCLA last season. So would not be surprised to see him get a lot better, just given how productive he really was. Given all of that, are there any immediate needs they may have at the defensive spot that we should address?
Yeah, standing out when looking at their defensive numbers, they did their best to address it in free agency. 29th in yards per pass attempt allowed, 22nd in pressure rate, 22nd in quarterback rating, and 31st in third down percentage allowed. So, you talk about the pass on third down most of the time. This is a unit that they've done their best at trying to address that. And I think given the present strength that they have a bit in that defensive line, I think while not necessarily a premium position, I think another position to be addressed here could be the linebacker position for them, as well as possibly shoring up that pass rush. Yeah. Given that they have invested in the secondary, follow the money, they're probably going to go in the other direction on the defensive side in the draft.
Agreed. So let's switch over tabs to the Colts mock draft simulation. They're picking at 14, and we will keep all the settings the same. Don't anticipate trading up, so I'm comfortable just kind of going to our spot, seeing who is still available and who ended up going. Now, we already really have our secondary being much better. Tyler Warren did go at 11 to San Francisco, so I'm guessing that they want just the scariest 12 personnel ever with Kittle and Warren. If you want to go Loveland, we can do that. But I think there may be some more premium positions we could go after. I'll really kick it over to you. What's the route you want to take here?
Yeah, so actually being a bit contrarian to the conventional layup of Colston Loveland to this pick that's being seen in mock drafts everywhere, I'd actually really like to bring in Jihad Campbell or Malachi Starks here as one of those linebacker safety kind of guys, at least with Starks. Campbell obviously being just a linebacker, but you look at that pass rush and the fact that the linebacker position dries up so fast in this draft, whereas the tight end class this year is actually decently strong. You look at Elijah Arroyo as an option in the second round, Harold Fannin falling despite the athleticism numbers, still a very productive receiver. So I think going Campbell here is probably the play, given that they have invested in the secondary already. So going Campbell to fill out the back of that base 4-3 in the linebacker slot would probably be the play.
No, I think that'd be great because he also does have that edge rusher versatility. He's someone who played typically off-ball linebacker first and second down, but on third down, he can still pin his ears back and rush the passer. And like you mentioned, the linebacker draft does not look so great this year, aside from a few guys like maybe Chris Paul Jr., but those guys are not as easy to get. And so I think Jihad Campbell, despite being a quote-unquote non-premium position, addresses their most immediate need, especially on the defensive spot.
Yeah, absolutely, and especially given the strength that they possess in the receiving core already, as well as the offensive line, that bringing in a tight end is going to bridge the two, but ultimately is not the most dire need on this team, I would say.
Agreed. So at this spot, there's a few guys who are available. There is the tight end Elijah Arroyo from Miami, tested really well as an athlete. So it's maybe a tad of a reach for him here, but it does address by far the most immediate need. There is Harold Fannin. We could go later if we want to go that route, or if there's a more immediate talent that we have, we can also go that route as well. So I'll really kick it over to you. Is there a specific route that we should take for this draft selection?
Yeah, so referencing back to their free agent signings, obviously bringing in like a corner / safety is something that they did. And as such, that kind of takes Xavier Watts and Trey Amos out of the guys that I would pick here, or that I would deem the most talented players on the board right now. And when you factor that out, you don't want to reach here on Arroyo. There are some other options like Gunnar Helm, Terrence Ferguson in the third round that can also fill out that tight end position. Kind trade back doesn't really look like an option here. And
we'd be dropping about 30 spots.
Everything else that's on the board here just does not really play into the hands of doing anything in the sense of value. We've already brought in Jihad Campbell to work on the off-ball linebacker edge position, so bringing in Tui Molowau or anybody else from that Ohio State defensive line just really doesn't make sense here. So while it's not the greatest value pick, I think just bringing in Elijah Arroyo to fill the most immediate need is the pick.
No, I agree. So we got Arroyo there. Then at the 80 spot, I still think despite addressing corner in free agency, there still is a little bit of a need because their second best corner, aside from Charvarius Ward, who's a guy they signed in free agency, is maybe Jalen Jones, and he's definitely not incredible. And so I think there are guys who are still available, maybe a little bit more towards that 117 spot. But if we want to double dip at linebacker, we can. Vernon Broughton could be a potential successor to DeForest Buckner.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot of guys still available. They also do have quite a need at center because they did lose Ryan Kelly to Minnesota. So I think that would be a good pick. I'll leave it up to you on what route you want to go, but I think Jared Wilson would be a good pick here.
Yeah, absolutely. And, while they do have a 14.7 on average across PFF, ESPN, and somebody else that I looked into the offensive line unit grades, they're about a middle of the road offensive line or maybe above average. The need that they do have is on that interior, and it's not listed here, but Jared Wilson would absolutely fill that.
Yeah, and he's probably the best pure center in this draft. I know there are some guys like Gray Zabel who are projected to be centers, but he's someone who played center all of his time in college and was really productive, and so I think he would be great. All right, let's see who is still available. Kobe Bryant went a few picks before, which is a bit of a bummer because I do like him a lot. Mello Dotson's still available, the other cornerback. I know we did take him with the Titans, but I think he would be a good way of addressing that need at the other boundary corner spot. And if you don't start him right away, you can have him for depth. I think that would probably address their most immediate need they may have here.
Yeah, absolutely. We've gone to that edge / linebacker area already. We've brought in a tight end. We've brought in interior offensive line. The next thing that stands out, obviously, is that secondary. And us going with Mello Dotson / Zy Alexander, Kobe Bryant, all in this area just kind of preaches to where the depth and value is positionally in this draft. The fourth round is going to be a lot of corners and running backs this year. And, you just got to play into that and take Mello Dotson here, I believe.
Yeah, let's do it. So next up, there's quite a bit of a gap between 151, 189, and then 232. I think if there is a talented running back that's still available, we could go that route just because Jonathan Taylor, despite being pretty good, is not super young at that position anymore. Yeah. I don't know how you feel about any of these guys. I personally like Kyle Madungai, maybe not at this early, but he is someone who does not fumble, is great in goal line situations, and is a really good pass blocker. But if there's a more immediate need, we could address safety again. Billy Bowman, great against the pass and runs really fast, which can't really ask for much more from that. Or if you want to go someone else, that is fine with me. Kyle Williams is still there, who is someone who's really undervalued, I think, in this draft simulator. So that would be great value. I think he was Chris Sims, wide receiver 2, which is maybe a little too rich, but really, really talented player.
Just a little bit. Obviously, while Jonathan Taylor is getting older, he still is under contract for a little while. And given the depth of this running back position and the lack thereof at the wide receiver position, I think you're absolutely right about Kyle Williams here. We've addressed other positions, and I think that this is just a sweet spot here to pick up a receiver that can possibly provide another option for the passers in Indianapolis, given the regression from Michael Pittman. Josh Downs, fantastic receiver, but ultimately a little undersized. And then, Adonai Mitchell has not panned out so well. And Alec Pierce is ultimately just a field stretcher. So bringing in somebody to at least push that unit and possibly break through. We've seen several day 3 success stories. They're not very common, but there's one or two every draft, and there's a chance that he's the one this time around.
Yeah. And I think whenever you don't have someone who can definitively be called a wide receiver one, it just makes sense to keep throwing darts at the board for a receiver, which is what Kyle Williams really does here. All right, 2 picks left, 189, 232. So here, it's just take guys that you like. I'm just going a little fast, but if there's anyone you personally like, I don't really care about reaching here because it is the 7th round. So it's really up to you.
The first thing that stands out to me is possibly just taking a shot at a running back that can be explosive behind Jonathan Taylor. We've seen issues with that running game when Taylor does go down. And as much as we love him, he has dealt with injury issues, tends to miss 1, 2, 3, 4 games every season. You look at Jordan James, could possibly be the next Bucky Irving if we want to start throwing bold takes around. Ollie Gordon, someone that can fill the role absolutely from Jonathan Taylor. And I think that's where I lean, despite the setback in 2024. This is a guy that won the Doak Walker in 2023, clearly has the stuff that it takes to be a good running back. And I think just being behind Jonathan Taylor and being in an environment where he can be behind a successful running back like that can help return him possibly to his 2023 form.
Yeah. And I think it's worth mentioning that whenever you're buying low, quote unquote, with a guy like this, there may still have that potential of how good he was this season before that. Because for those who aren't aware, it was really a 2-man race between him and Gentry on who was supposed to be the best running back in the NCAA. And obviously Gentry went one way, being a award-winning running back, someone who's going to go early first round. And then Ollie Gordon just really regressed. But like you mentioned, a lot of that is due to the offensive line situation not looking so hot. And so I think it's worth it to just buy low in a guy like this, especially because we're picking late 6th, early 7th. It's really just worth the dart throw at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And then again, sticking with the theme that we've kind of done here, I think bringing in another quarterback does not hurt this situation, especially given that Daniel Jones is only on a 1-year contract that gives you a long-term backup behind Anthony Richardson. Looking at Brady Cook here, another guy that had a down 2024 season, but had a pretty good 2023. Will Rogers as well, the Mississippi State transfer that went over to Washington. He's an interesting case as well, although Washington did not have a great year. But I think Brady Cook is your guy, especially given if we're going to try to help our draft grade out a little bit here, falling about 30 picks past where he's ranked in the PFF system.
No, I love it. All right, so what grade do you think we've got in this draft? I think we're going to get a little bit higher. I'm going to go A-, but you give me yours.
I don't want to keep saying B+, so I'm going to go A-. Okay. I believe that going Arroyo being a reach, I think that the system doesn't properly emphasize what they did in free agency, and where it has safety as such a strong need, as you can see with Xavier Watts, especially with the reach on Arroyo. But ultimately, I'm staring down that A+ from Jihad Campbell, and that makes me feel good about this draft.
Agreed. All right, a few C's, 1 A+, B+, man.
And another B+.
3 straight B+. Yep. All right, let's move on next. Or before we do that, were there any closing thoughts on what we've done so far with the Colts draft?
I think that it addresses the needs properly. Like I said, this division is very wide open in a 3-horse race this year. Theoretically, it should really be the Texans to lose. And unfortunately, with what they've done with that offensive line that we're going to talk about momentarily, that they are trying to lose it. And, looking at the Colts, they fill all the needs that they can have. They don't have glaring, absolute dire holes in any one unit. So picking guys that can be thrown into each of these units and possibly break through as contributors is something that this draft does. And I think that it ultimately addresses the 2 biggest in maybe 3 biggest needs that they have with their first 3 picks, and then circles through and fills in players in different positional groups that are not necessarily strong that could potentially be strengthened by some day 4 luck or day 3 luck.
Yeah. All right, so let's transition to the Texans, and they had what you would definitely call an active free agency. As you can see, the amount of moves they've made can barely fit on the screen. But just to kind of briefly summarize what they've done so far, they pretty much traded Laramie Tunsil in order to get C.J. Gardner-Johnson. They replaced Laramie Tunsil with Cam Robinson. And then they just signed a bunch of bodies to potentially address some needs. But one of the more notable ones that they made was releasing Shaq Mason, trading Kenyon Green, and then extending Derek Stingley, where it's 3 years, $90 million. That is a little bit misleading because that's tacked on to the end of his rookie deal. So it looks like it's $30 million average annual value. It's really more so in like the 25 range, which is a little less surprising. But yeah, do you have any brief like summarization of what the Texans have done so far?
Well, looking at this, their biggest need, most obviously, is offensive line. And I think that they took an approach that is certainly unique, where not only did they look at their offensive line and not necessarily build on it, but more so took a addition by subtraction approach in their eyes to things by moving on from Shaq Mason, moving on from Laramie Tunsil with supposed character issues, then bringing in Cam Robinson on a 1-year deal that at least can prove it. He's shown to be a fringe starting quality tackle in the league. So bringing him in on a 1-year deal. You bring in Lincoln Tomlinson as well, another one of those fringe guys that's been interesting that can be along this offensive line with what I would assume they bring in a rookie, Trent Brown as well. It seems like they're just kind of going with the second chance you approach along this offensive line. And then bringing in Christian Kirk to at least fill the gap and void that is left by Tank Dell's injury for a very cheap price, by the way, only a 7th round pick, if I'm not mistaken, maybe a 6th. And I don't even think it's this year. So bringing in, although it's an exorbitant contract, they have a lot of money to play with, given that CJ Stroud hasn't been extended, only really Nico Collins, and now Derek Stingley is on the books, as well as Will Anderson coming up. So overall, they took the quantity approach, absolutely. But they did a good job of not spending too much money in any one area so that if and when some of these guys work out and end up being quality contributors for this team, they're getting it for a cheap price.
Yeah, I think you summarized it perfectly, that they're essentially throwing as many darts in the board as possible. And if one of those sticks offensive line wise, then they're happy. Part of the reason why they did trade Laramie Tunsil may have been for financial reasons as well, because they're not necessarily pressed up against the cap, but they definitely are not as cap flexible as a team like the Commanders were, who were willing to give up quite a bit of draft capital in order to get a guy like that. But let's cover their depth chart here. Obviously, their wide receiver 1 and arguably the best contract in all football is Nico Collins. He's super special. Whenever he was healthy, he was maybe better than Justin Jefferson, almost as good as Justin Jefferson, which just says so much about his talent. Yeah, and then after that, Tank Dell did unfortunately go down due to injury. He's probably going to be out the entire season. Just one of those freak injuries that is really unfortunate. Christian Kirk, like you mentioned, kind of addresses some of those voids that Tank Dell does leave. And then they really just patchwork their offensive line. They're hoping one of these guys ends up working out. We don't really know exactly if they will, but that may be an approach we'll need to take in the draft. Do you see any immediate needs, aside from maybe the obvious at offensive line, that we should address in the draft for this team?
So when I look at this draft, as much as I'd like to address the receiver position, I'm not necessarily sure that Houston can afford to do so, even though that they will be in a position in which they can get a receiver in the first round. it's kind of going to be that debate that we had with Penei Sewell and Jamar Chase back in the draft when the Bengals had needs along the offensive line and in the receiving core to an extent, where I think the Texans should really lean the other direction here and go with that offensive line. You look at their offensive line rank, and I mean, I don't even need to tell you the numbers, but I'm sure you can guess across 3 sites, they're ranked 32nd, 31st, 29th, worst offensive line in the league, pretty much consensus. Absolutely where they need to address things. And I think that ultimately Nico Collins being a fantastic receiver, Christian Kirk having proven to be semi worth the money, but ultimately overshadowed by Brian Thomas and Calvin Ridley over in Jacksonville, that he fills a void, as well as bringing in Braxton Berrios is a nice veteran presence to have there. John Mechie can stretch the field for these guys very fast. So offensive line, absolutely the biggest need here. That would be where I would lean.
All right, so let's move on to the defense. And their defense has a lot of quality players, obviously, with Will Anderson being number one, and then Danielle Hunter getting, I think it was like a $35 million extension for 1 year. It was a lot of money to pay Danielle Hunter, who has been really good for a while. But aside from that, Derek Stingley is obviously one of the best cornerbacks in football. They do have some needs, I would say, at the interior spot for their defense, and then their linebackers are solid, but definitely could improve there. So do you have any immediate needs they may have at the defense spot that we can address in the draft?
So the good news for the Texans is this is a very deep cornerback class. And when you look at the draft capital that we'll be getting into with the Texans, they only have the late first rounder, late second rounder, and then if I'm not mistaken, they do actually have 2 third-round picks as well that they can have some leeway in terms of filling spots here. I think that kind of just sprinkling in talent in each of the position groups is the move in terms of what they should be drafting. They were a top 5 unit in yards per play allowed, yards per pass attempt allowed, quarterback rating allowed, rushing yards per attempt allowed, third down defense. They were phenomenal across the board. And I think that it's possibly a little bit chalked up to the fantastic defensive scheme that DeMeco Ryans draws up with how aggressive they are on defense, but that this is a unit that at least the Texans can afford to not address right away with their premium draft picks and maybe spend their 3rd and 4th round picks fixing up tiny holes in this defense, potentially injecting a little bit of talent there.
Yeah, 100%. So we are going to conclude this total simulation with the Texans. They're picking at the 25th overall spot, so relatively late in the first round. But let's get things going. Are you feeling more so sticking and picking, trading back? I mean, it's going to depend on who's on the board here, but there's a few guys we have. It's mainly defense, which is not one of their more immediate needs. I do like Bray Zabel here, but I'll kick it over to you on who you may prefer the most between any of these guys.
So, I'm going kind of against my word, but my very first thought is I can't believe Luther Burden is on the board again. But I think that, as it says, wide receiver and offensive line, the 2 biggest glaring needs, despite how bad the offensive line is, ultimately the offensive line does not dry up until the 2nd round, whereas the wide receiver class dries up after Luther Burden. And I think that this draft, they are very lucky to possibly be able to address both positions. So I'm probably going Luther Burden here with the expectation that there's at least one really good option along the O-line left when we get to the 2nd round.
Yeah, let's do it. I also think one of the guys that's not talked about enough is Charles Cross is it Charles Cross? Wait. It's William and Mary.
From William and Mary.
Charles Grant. Sorry, Charles Cross is the tackle from
Grant.
Yeah, Charles Grant. Yeah. He's arguably the best run blocking offensive lineman in this draft. 93 zone grade, which is really high. So we don't have to take him this early, but he is someone that could potentially be on the radar.
Yeah.
So let's see who is available at the offensive line, because we are much better at receiver now. Yeah, Arante Ursary is probably going to be the best one.
You're absolutely you're absolutely right about Charles. Fantastic slept-on option. I think that I was really hoping to see Donovan Jackson somehow get to this pick. He was another guy that filled in admirably with all of the players going down along the offensive line at Ohio State this year. He was slid around between guard and center, and I believe even at tackle at one point, showing some versatility that would really be helpful for a team like the Texans that has this approach of just throwing darts at all of these fringe guys and hoping they work out. That having a guy that could slide around based on who doesn't work out would be nice for the Texans. Ultimately, going with the tackle out of Minnesota here is probably the best play, especially given how badly they need offensive line, and even could consider double dipping here in the third round, depending on what's there.
Yeah, I really don't mind that, because if they're going to take this approach of prioritizing quantity over quality with their free agency class, I think it makes sense to do something similar, just given how a lot of these quality guys or guys that they end up picking up in free agency are absolute fringe starters at best. And so we just need guys that we can trust. And the more bites we take at this apple, I think gives us a better chance.
Yeah, and I see we have 89 as a pick as well. So, worth getting a little risky to see if Grant is still there. If we look along the interior and just seeing what else is available on the interior offensive line.
Interior offensive line, let's see what we got. Jared Wilson is still there. We talked about him a bit. Willie Lampkin. He's someone who does not have the traditional physical profile of a guard / center, but he is 5'11", 290, which is tiny. But he is great at playing with leverage. He's good at moving in space. And so he could be a later pick if we want to make that. I'll really leave it up to you if you want to keep going offensive line or if you want to pick someone else.
Yeah, so I do, as much as I want to go offensive line, I think it's overkill to pick a bunch of them, and especially thinking that we could possibly get Charles here with our next pick. I think this is a spot where the Texans can probably make their fans sweat a little bit by going against the grain and picking something other than wide receiver or tight end. I look at rushing game, and that's something that I think would need to be addressed at some point. We picked up a receiver, and something that I'd like to explore is Chris Paul Jr. here. Their pass rush. I told you about all the things that they had that they were top 5, top 10 in, but at least with Chris Paul Jr. here, he fills a middle of the road pressure rate front 7 from Houston. They ranked only 14th at pressure rate last year. So I think making their fans sweat a little bit and bringing in a profile like this that can address the linebacker and defensive line would be a good move.
And I think he in many ways makes your pass rush indirectly better, because he's a little bit more of one of those run stopper / pass defender type of guys. He's a little bit smaller from the off-ball linebacker profile, being 6'1". But when you have Danielle Hunter, whenever you have Will Anderson, and you have a guy like Chris Paul who you can trust to guard behind those guys, it allows them to really pin their ears back and do what they do best. So I think Chris Paul would be great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now we're just praying Charles Grant falls. And I don't think I saw his name.
No, so I mean, especially given Jonah, I see Farmer. I think Charles Grant here is our guy.
Yeah, and I think, one underrated need for the Texans is that, Joe Mixon, despite being really talented, is not super young. And so I have a proposition. There are 4 guys I like.
So I do.
Here. And so let's see if we can get up a little bit in this draft. Yeah, I
that's
think
actually
this gives
something
us,
that to it. I think that I can address as well. You look at Mixon, not exactly on the best side of the age curve. Damian Pierce has been ineffective and, in fact, had 170 yards until the final game of the season, roughly, maybe less than that. And his contract as well. This is a fantastic running back class. I would even see if anybody has a higher pick than the Eagles do in terms of the one after our next, like, most recent pick, and just seeing if there's a possibility to kind of stack two together, looking at like 99 and 105 right there. Even if we have to throw in something from the next draft for the Texans to make that happen, I think that that's absolutely something to be explored, even if you just throw in a wow.
All right,
there
so
it is.
We're dropping back 10 spots, but we're getting much better depth. And I think Charles Grant is still there. So I think this works out perfect. Yeah, and then we can go Devin Neal if he's still there. We can go Damian Martinez. We can address one of these immediate needs. Yeah.
Yes.
So Charles Grant, perfect spot for them here. And then Devin Neal's still there.
Devin Neal's
still
there. I feel like it's I feel like, especially with Martinez going, that it's, you don't really have to debate much. Devin Neal, he's a guy that's going to come in and be that perfect handcuff to Joe Mixon, take some workload off of him. This is a guy that he's not necessarily phenomenal in any right, but this is a professional running back. This is a guy that can pass block, run, catch, and even run block too when they would have the quarterback at Kansas do design runs. This is a fantastic running back that would fit a scheme, any scheme, perfectly.
Yep, I love it. All right, we have 2 picks left. There's quite a bit of a drop-off from here. We have one at 236 and one at 241. And so we'll just kind of let that ride. It is going a little slow, but gives us time to talk about what's been happening so far for this team. So first, we addressed the most immediate need at receiver, and then we really shored up that offensive line with Ursay and Charles Grant. Get a better running back, and then you really shore up that off-ball linebacker need here with Chris Paul. So it's really just take your guys that you like. So I don't know if there's anyone calling your name immediately now, but it is the floor. Or the floor is yours to pick pretty much whoever you want here.
Yeah, a name that makes me chuckle a little bit is Kyron Lacy. Scrolling past that with what happened. I think looking at Malachi Moore, just exploring just the Bama pedigree. I'm just mentioning Kyron Lacy for the off-field issues. But looking at Malachi Moore, underrated contributor on that Bama team, just an unfortunate season for that program. I think this is a guy that can come in and be that rotational depth piece in that secondary, and really just we're in luxury depth pick territory anyways, to where this is just a guy that you can pick up and hope he works out.
Yeah. And he's someone who got better every season, which there's going to be value in that. And then at this point, if we want to go tight end with Gadsden, that's fine with me. Smile Mondon is also a solid linebacker out of Georgia. And then Fintrell Cypress, a pretty solid cornerback. Really, pick is yours, but any of these guys are fine with me.
Yeah, I think addressing that tight end position, especially just in the event that Dalton Schultz is not panning out. He hasn't been particularly amazing in Houston, but he hasn't been bad either. He's just been a pretty solid contributor. And it seems like this team just kind of needs another piece. I know they have a former Ohio State tight end behind Schultz at this point, whose name escapes my mind, but Brandon Gadsden to at least have some depth in that room. Especially, this is a scheme that wants to run the ball a little more. So having personnel that can go into the 12, even 13 bag if they needed to, and not have Tank Dell pass blocking or run blocking is something to have.
Yeah. So, what grade do you think we got for this draft? I think we made a lot of moves they're going to like, especially with Luther Burden, and then guys like Charles Grant. But I'll kind of kick it over to you. What do you think we got grade wise for this one?
So I think we finally cracked the A tier here.
Okay.
Obviously, you look at the top of the screen; it doesn't like that we passed on Jerry Wilson, but we turned around and brought in Charles. So we still addressed the offensive line position. I think this is an A-.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of picks they liked here. And yeah, man, you were 3 for 4 in terms of picking for our draft grades, but yeah, you were within a plus or minus grading there. So great job.
Yeah, right. And for the record, the one I got wrong, I just didn't want to say B- 3 times in a row. So
yeah,
there's that.
No, that's fair. So let's remove this. Were there any kind of lessons that you think we learned doing this sort of exercise for each of these teams?
I think it really preaches to the way that GMs are going to think in the draft. They're going to look at what they spent money on in free agency and then look at the absolute floor that they can address needs while still getting quality players, and kind of reason backwards from there in a game theory sense, where they can look and say, okay, even though this running back class is phenomenal and we could probably use a running back, we can wait a little while until we have to pick one. Corner, this is a not very top-heavy, talented corner class, but a very deep corner class that we can wait a little while there as well. We saw multiple times in the 4th round that there's going to be big runs on running backs and corners, and that just showing how GMs probably think in these scenarios maybe helps the fans be a little at ease, knowing that there's a lot of factors that come in play. And even though a position group might be bad the year before, if you have spent money on it in free agency, you can't go overkill and continue to address that position group. You have to trust that your free agency signings were good and lean into other directions to fill other needs.
Well, thanks so much for coming on, Nathan. If you have anything to plug, where can the listeners, viewers find your work? Feel free to do that now.
I have a Twitter that I don't really ever use, so that's why I didn't really bother to add it underneath. I do a lot of research, paper findings. I do data analysis for a high school football team currently looking to transition into the professional and collegiate ranks, working on a project for UCF baseball right now. I do a lot of studies, and those can all be found on my LinkedIn. It should be just Nathan Wright 24. There's not a lot of Nathan Wrights in the world, but I guarantee there's not many Nathan Wrights that do sports analysis.
Well, this is Analytics with Asa, and thank you for listening.